everybody, what's up? Welcome back to A People's Historian. My name is Jason Kishinev. We are reading an Indigenous People's History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. Just about to start Chapter 2. Remember, if you like the show, if you like the episode, if you like what you hear, hit the like and subscribe button and hit that notification bell so you get notified when I make a new video. Let's dig in. Chapter 2, Culture of Conquest. The quotation at the beginning of the chapter. The discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the aboriginal population, the beginning of the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of blackskins, signaled the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production. These idyllic proceedings are the chief moments of prior accumulation. Karl Marx, from Genesis of the Industrial Capitalist. How it began. The late anthropologist Edward H. Spicer wrote that the initial Europeans who participated in colonization of the Americas were heirs to rich and ancient cultures, social relations, and customs in their lands of origin, whether Spain, France, Holland, or England. In their passage to the Americas and encountering the indigenous inhabitants, they largely abandoned the webs of European social relations. What each actually participated in was a culture of conquest, violence, expropriation, destruction, and dehumanization. Spicer's observation is true, but the culture of conquest didn't start with Europeans crossing the Atlantic. European institutions and the world view of conquest and colonialism had formed several centuries before that. From the 11th through the 13th centuries, Europeans conducted the Crusades to conquer North Africa and the Middle East, leading to unprecedented wealth in the hands of a few. The profit-based religion was and that is profit as in money, the profit-based religion was the deadly element that European merchants and settlers brought to the Americas. In addition to seeking personal wealth, colonizers expressed a Christian zeal that justified colonialism. Along with that came the militaristic tradition that had also developed in Western Europe during the Crusades, literally carrying of the cross. Although the popes, beginning with Urban II, called for most of the ventures, the crusading armies were mercenary outfits that promised to the soldiers the right to sack and loot Muslim towns and cities, feats that would gain them wealth and prestige back home. Toward the end of the 13th century, the papacy began directing such mercenaries to crush domestic enemies in their midst as well, pagans and commoners in general, especially women, as ostensible witches and heretics. In this way, knights and noblemen could seize land and force the commoners living on it into servitude. Historian Peter Linnebaugh notes that whereas the anti-Muslim crusades were attempts to control the lucrative Muslim trade routes to the Far East, the domestic crusades against heretics and commoners were carried out to terrorize poor people and at the same time to enlist them in the lucrative and adventurous yet holy venture Crusading was thus a murderous device to resolve a contradiction by bringing baron and commoner together in the cauldron of religious war. The first population forcibly organized under the profit motive, whose labor was exploited well before overseas exploitation was possible, was the European peasantry. Once forced off their land, they had nothing to eat and nothing to sell but their labor, as Yanis Varoufakis talks about quite eloquently. In addition, entire nations such as Scotland, Wales, Ireland, Bohemia, the Basque Country, and Catalonia were colonized and forced under the rule of various monarchies. The Moorish nation and the Sephardic Jewish minority were conquered and physically deported by the Castilian Aragon monarchy from the Iberian Peninsula, a long-term project culminating in group expulsions beginning in 1492, the year Columbus sailed to America. The institutions of colonialism and methods for relocation, deportation, and expropriation of land had already been practiced, if not perfected, by the end of the 15th century. The rise of the modern state in Western Europe was based on the accumulation of wealth by means of exploiting human labor and displacing millions of subsistence producers from their lands. The armies that did this work benefited from technological innovations that allowed the development of more effective weapons of death and destruction. When these states expanded overseas to obtain even more resources, land and labor, they were not starting anew. The peoples of West Africa, the Caribbean, Mesoamerica, and the Andes were the first overseas victims. South Africa, North America, and the rest of South America followed. Then came all of Africa, the Pacific, and Asia. The sea voyages of European explorers and merchants in the late 15th and early 16th centuries were not the first of their kind. These voyagers borrowed the techniques for long-distance sea travel from the Arab world. Before the Arabs ventured into the Indian Ocean, Inuits, or Eskimos, plied the Arctic Circle in their kayaks for centuries and made contacts with many people, as did Norse, South Asian, Chinese, Japanese, Peruvian, and Melanesian and Polynesian fishing peoples of the Pacific. Egyptian and Greek knowledge of the seas most likely extended beyond the Mediterranean into the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. Western European seagoing merchants and the monarchies that backed them would differ only in that they had developed the basis for colonial domination and exploitation of labor in those colonies that led to the capture and enslavement of millions of Africans to transport to their American colonies. Land as private property. Along with the cargo of European ships, especially of the later British colonizing ventures, came the emerging concept of land as private property. Esther Kingston Mann, a specialist in Russian land tenure history, has reconstructed the elevation of land as private property to sacred status in 16th century England. The English used the term enclosure to denote the privatization of the commons. During this time, peasants, who constituted a large majority of the population, were evicted from their ancient common lands. For centuries, the commons had been their pasture for milk cows and for running sheep, and their source of water, wood for fuel and construction, and edible and medicinal wild plants. Without these resources, they could not have survived as farmers, and they did not survive as farmers after they lost access to the commons. Not only were the commons privatized during the 16th and 17th centuries, they were also transformed into grazing lands for commercial sheep production, wool being the main domestic and export commodity, creating wealth for a few and impoverishment for the many. Because you didn't need that many people to raise sheep. Denied access to the former commons, rural subsistence farmers and even their children had no choice but to work in the new woolen textile factories under miserable conditions. That is, when they could find such work, for unemployment was high. Employed or not, this displaced population was available to serve as settlers in the North American British colonies, many of them as indentured servants, with the promise of land. After serving their terms of indenture, they were free to squat on indigenous land and become farmers again. In this way, surplus labor created not only low labor costs and great profits for the woolens manufacturers, but also a supply of settlers for the colonies, which was an escape valve in the home country, where impoverishment could lead to uprisings of the exploited. The sacred status of property in the forms of land taken from indigenous farmers and of Africans as chattel was seeded into the drive for Anglo-American independence from Britain and the founding of the United States. Privatization of land was accompanied by an ideological drive to paint the commoners who resisted as violent, stupid, and lazy. The English Parliament, under the guise of fighting backwardness, criminalized former rights to the commons. Accompanying it and facilitating the privatization of the commons was the suppression of women, as feminist theorist Silvia Federici has argued, by conjuring witchcraft. Those accused of witchcraft were poor peasant women, often widows, while the accusers tended to be wealthier, either their landlords or employers, individuals who controlled local institutions or had ties to the national government. Neighbors were encouraged to accuse one another. Witchcraft was considered mainly a female crime, especially at the peak of the witch hunts between 1550 and 1650, when more than 80% of those who were charged with witchcraft, tried, convicted, and executed were women. In England, those accused of witchcraft were mostly elderly women, often beggars, sometimes the wives of living laborers, but usually widows. Actions and local occurrences said to indicate witchcraft Actions and local occurrences said to indicate witchcraft included non-payment of rent, demands for public assistance, giving the evil eye, local die-offs of horses or other stock, and mysterious deaths of children. Also among the telltale actions were practices related to midwifery and any kind of contraception. The service that women provided among the poor as healers was one of a number of vestiges from pre-Christian matrilineal institutions that once predominated in Europe. It is no surprise that those who had held on to and perpetuated these communal practices were those most resistant to the enclosure to the commons, the economic base of the peasantry, as well as women's autonomy. The traumatized souls thrown off the land, as well as their descendants, became the land-hungry settlers enticed to cross a vast ocean with the promise of land and attaining the status of gentry. English settlers brought witch hunting with them to Jamestown, Virginia, and to Salem, Massachusetts. In language reminiscent of that used to condemn witches, they quickly identified the indigenous populations as inherently children of Satan and servants of the devil who deserved to be killed. Wow. Later, the Salem authorities would justify witch trials by claiming that the English settlers were inhabiting land controlled by the devil. White supremacy and class. Also part of the Christian colonizers' outlook was a belief in white supremacy. As an 1878 U.S. Protestant evangelical hymn suggests, "Are your garments spotless? Are they white as snow? Are they washed in the blood of the Lamb?" Whiteness as an ideology involves much more than skin color, although skin color has been and continues to be a key component of racism in the United States. You think? White supremacy can be traced to the colonizing ventures of the Christian Crusades in Muslim-controlled territories and to the Protestant colonization of Ireland. As dress rehearsals for the colonization of the Americas, these projects form the two strands that merge into the geopolitical and socio-cultural makeup of U.S. society. The Crusades in the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal today, and expulsion of Jews and Muslims were part of a process that created the core ideology for modern colonialism, white supremacy, and its justification for genocide. The Crusades gave birth to the papal law of limpieza de sangre, cleanliness of blood, for which the Inquisition was established by the Church to investigate and determine. Before this time, the concept of biological race based on blood is not known to have existed as law or taboo in Christian Europe or anywhere else in the world. As scapegoating and suspicion of conversos, Jews who had converted to Christianity, and Moriscos, Muslims who had converted to Christianity, intensified over several centuries in Christian-controlled Spain, the doctrine of limpieza de sangre was popularized. It had the effect of granting psychological and increasingly legal privileges to old Christians, both rich and poor, thus obscuring the class differences between the landed aristocracy and land-poor peasants and shepherds. Whatever their economic station, the old Christian Spanish were enabled to identify with the nobility. As one Spanish historian puts it, the common people looked upwards, wishing and hoping to climb, and let themselves be seduced by chivalric ideals, honor, dignity, glory, and the noble life. Lope de Vega, a 16th century contemporary of Cervantes, wrote, "Soy un hombre, aunque de viana casta, limpio de sangre y jamás de Hebrea o mora manchada. Should I just let you? No, just kidding. I am a man, although of lowly status, yet clean of blood, and with no mixture of Jewish or Moorish blood. This cross-class mindset can be found as well in the stance of descendants of the old settlers of British colonization in North America. This then in the first instance of class leveling based on imagined racial sameness, the origin of white supremacy, the essential ideology of colonial projects in America and Africa. As Elie Wiesel famously observed, the road to Auschwitz was paved in the earliest days of Christendom. Historian David Stannard in American Holocaust adds the caveat that the same road led straight through the heart of America. The ideology of white supremacy was paramount in neutralizing the class antagonisms of the landless against the landed and distributing confiscated lands and properties of Moors and Jews in Iberia, of the Irish in Ulster, and of Native American and African peoples. Cheerful. What'd you expect? Great Britain, emerging as an overseas colonial power a century after Spain did, absorbed aspects of the Spanish racial caste system into its colonial rationalizations, particularly regarding African slavery, but it did so within the context of Protestantism, which imagined a chosen people founding and raising a new Jerusalem. The English did not just adapt the habits and experiences of Spanish colonization. They had their own prior experience, which actually constituted overseas imperialism. During the early 17th century, the English conquered Ireland and declared 500,000 acres of land in the north open to settlement. The settlers who served early settler colonialism came mostly from western Scotland. England had previously conquered Wales and Scotland, but it had never before attempted to remove so large an indigenous population and plant settlers in their place as in Ireland. The ancient Irish social system was systematically attacked, traditional songs and music forbidden, whole clans exterminated, and the remainder brutalized. A wild Irish reservation was even attempted. The plantation of Ulster was as much a culmination of as it was a departure from centuries of intermittent warfare in Ireland. In the 16th century, the official in charge of the Irish province of Munster, Sir Humphrey Gilbert, ordered that the heads of all of those, of what sort soever they were, which were killed in the day, should be cut off from their bodies and brought to the place where he, Gilbert, encamped at night, and should there be laid on the ground by each side of the way, leading into his own tent. I think that's supposed to be leading into his own tent, so that none could come into his tent for any cause, but commonly he must pass through a lane of heads, which he used ad terrorem. It brought great terror to the people when they saw the heads of their dead fathers, brothers, children, kinsfolk, and friends. It would sure terrorize me. The English government paid bounties for the Irish heads. Later, only the scalp or ears were required. Oh my goodness. A century later in North America, Indian heads and scalps were brought in for bounty in the same manner, although the Irish were as white as the English, transforming them into alien others to be exterminated, previewed what came to be perceived as racialist when applied to indigenous peoples of North America and to Africans. And if I might add, she's not mentioning, but those Irish came to America as immigrants and were also treated as less than human, and indeed had to compete with blacks for servant jobs. And they kind of got pit against each other, the Irish immigrants and the free blacks. At that conjuncture, both in the Christian crusades against Muslims and England's invasion of Ireland, the transition from religious wars to the genocidal mode of colonialism is apparent. The Irish, under British colonial rule, well into the 20th century, continued to be regarded as biologically inferior. During the mid-19th century, influenced by social Darwinism, some English scientists peddled the theory that the Irish, and all people of color, had descended from apes, while the English were descendants of man who had been created by God in his own image. This makes me so sad reading this stuff. Why people gotta treat people like this? Thus the English were angels, and the Irish and other colonized peoples were a lower species, which today, us, Christian identity, white supremacists called mud people, inferior products of the process of evolution. The same Sir Humphrey Gilbert, who had been in charge of the colonization of Ulster, planted the first English colonial settlement in North America in Newfoundland in the summer of 1583. In the lead-up to the formation of the United States, Protestantism uniquely refined white supremacy as part of a politico-religious ideology. Before I go on, let me ask you a philosophical question. Now, we know how history went, but if situations were reversed, would Native Americans, indigenous peoples, darker skinned peoples in Africa and South America, would they have perpetrated the same crimes against white people if they were the ones with power? Put your answer in the comments. I'm curious what you have to say. Terminal narratives. According to the current consensus among historians, the wholesale transfer of land from indigenous to Euro-American hands that occurred in the Americas after 1492 is due less to European invasion, warfare, and material acquisitiveness than to the bacteria that the invaders unwittingly brought with them. Historian Colin Calloway is among the proponents of this theory, and he writes that the epidemic diseases would have caused massive depopulation in the Americas, whether brought by European invaders or brought home by Native American traders. Such an absolutist assertion renders any other fate for the indigenous peoples improbable. Professor Calloway is a careful and widely respected historian of indigenous North America, but his conclusion articulates a default assumption. The thinking behind the assumption is both ahistorical and illogical, in that Europe itself lost a third to 1/2 of its population to infectious disease during medieval pandemics. The principal reason the consensus view is wrong and ahistorical is that it erases the effects of settler colonialism with its antecedents in the Spanish Reconquest and the English conquest of Scotland, Ireland, and Wales. By the time Spain, Portugal, and Britain arrived to colonize the Americas, their methods of eradicating peoples or forcing them into dependency and servitude were ingrained, streamlined, and effective. If disease could have done the job, it is not clear why the European colonizers in America found it necessary to carry out unrelenting wars against indigenous communities in order to gain every inch of land they took from them. Nearly 300 years of colonial warfare, followed by continued wars waged by the independent republics of the hemisphere. Whatever disagreement may exist about the size of pre-colonial indigenous populations, no one doubts that a rapid demographic decline occurred in the 16th and 17th centuries. Its timing from region to region, depending on what conquest and colonization began. Nearly all the population areas of the Americas were reduced by 90% following the onset of colonizing projects, decreasing the targeted indigenous populations of the Americas from 100 million to 10 million. Commonly referred to as the most extreme demographic disaster, framed as natural in human history. It was rarely called genocide until the rise of indigenous movements in the mid-20th century forged questions. And I'm going to cut us off there. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did, hit that like and subscribe button. Hit that notification bell. We'll see you next time. Thanks for tuning in.